So recently, I've been thinking an awful lot about Pokemon.
But I thought you didn't like Pokemon anymore.
Can you let me talk for like 5 seconds without interrupting?
Okay, yeah, that was kind of uncalled for, I'm sorry.
Thank you. God. Yes, my old video about me not liking Pokemon does still stand. The apathy hasn't really gone anywhere. I don't intend to buy Legend Z to A or any other game they might shit out in the coming months. However, I've found a new way to express my burnout, one that uses my vast experience with Pokemon and its YouTube ecosystem without furthering said burnout. My Pokemon Challenge Run parodies. Now, I have an absolute blast making these, and I'm not gonna lie, they're some of my best work. However, on some level, that makes me a complete fraud. You wanna know why? Because as I'm sitting here, dunking on all of these Pokemon YouTubers from atop my high horse, the moment Emblem uploads a Fire Emblem challenge run, I whimsically levitate over to my computer like a cartoon character smelling a freshly baked pie on the windowsill, and sit my ass down to watch the whole thing. Now, what is it here that's causing this disconnect, this hypocrisy over here on the Soda Crab channel? Are Fire Emblem YouTubers just better than Pokemon YouTubers? Yeah, not necessarily. At first, I thought it came down to the simple fact that Fire Emblem is a better game series than Pokemon. Now, I, alongside every YouTuber on the planet, have already made a video about Pokemon's downfall in quality, so I'll spare you the history lesson and the high-quality animations. But yeah, even if you really don't like the most recent Fire Emblem entries, there's no denying that the franchise is in a much better place than Pokemon's current spot beyond rock bottom. So case closed, right? Pokemon bad, Fire Emblem good, so I like watching Fire Emblem videos. Well, still no. In a world where Pokemon was still good, in a world where Scarlet and Violet really stuck the landing and I liked these series equally, Pokemon would still be a far less rigorous single-player experience, and thus a worse game for this challenge run content. So that's what I want to talk about in today's video. I want to compare Pokemon and Fire Emblem, both as Nintendo's flagship RPGs and two series that mean a lot to me. Hopefully my points here will help explain why I can sit down and watch a 6-hour highlight reel of a Fire Emblem Iron Man, but have a hard time getting through a 30-minute edited Nuzlocke even as background noise for chores. Okay, so for my first point, let's just address the giant, absolutely titanic elephant in the room. I want to get the whole pissing a ton of people off bit out of the way right up front. Let's face it, Pokemon is an easy baby game. For the more self-aware among you, this shouldn't come as a surprise, but I know there's a significant contingent of people that just refuse to admit this. And that's okay. I was one of you, sitting at the lunch table with my 3DS back in high school, telling all the people laughing at me that Pokemon is for everyone. And yeah, it can be. Play what you want, every game is for everyone. But the only everyone this game is designed for is everyone between the ages of 5 and 12. Now, I get that Pokemon actually has a fairly interesting competitive scene. I myself wander in and out of vague interest in it from time to time. But we're not talking about your Smogons, your agencies, your Regulation XYZ World Championships. We're talking about getting from your mom's house to the Hall of Fame. That, right there, where 99% of players' experience starts and ends, is home to some of the most Cocomelon-ass gameplay this side of Play with Teletubbies on PlayStation 1. You can play just about any Pokemon game with just about any Pokemon. And I mean Pokemon in either its singular or plural form, because there are only like 2 impossible solo runs in the series' history. I was able to beat Pokemon Sapphire and Fire Red as a 4-year-old. A 4-year-old. For reference, here is a list of games that 4-year-old Soda Crab could barely even make progress in. Luigi's Mansion, Sonic Adventure 2, Paper Mario: The Thousand-Year Door. You know, real bastions of difficulty, real hardcore games for hardcore gamers. There's a reason you need 1,500 different rules and restrictions to make Pokemon challenging. And that's if you're even sticking to an actual Pokemon game, instead of upping the difficulty by playing Pokemon Sacred Blaze Eternal Photonic Syncing Black and White Kaizo Omega 2 instead. Pokemon games, plain and simple, are not designed with any kind of difficulty in mind. The devs give you, as the player, an overwhelming mechanical advantage from the onset. You can use unlimited items in battle, and you can switch your Pokemon without wasting a turn. 2 things the AI simply cannot do. Even if you elect to not use these two mechanics, which is entirely self-imposed, therefore not actually reflecting on the game's difficulty, you're still almost always rocking a party of higher level, higher quality, and more numerous Pokemon than your opponent. What the ever-loving fuck is Volkner supposed to do against your Garchomp, let alone the 5 other guys you have waiting in the back to jump him if things go south? Faced with your overwhelming power, the game throws the most rudimentary of challenges at you, like, do you have a Pokemon with a good type matchup? Or, actually that's all the game really ever asks of you, and you know what? That actually makes complete sense, because it's hard for developers to design a challenging and engaging fight when from the very beginning of the game, your party could have dozens, hundreds, or thousands of different combinations that all need to work. I say it's hard and not impossible, since this doesn't stop other series like Shin Megami Tensei, but I'm still throwing Pokemon this bone here. This neutered difficulty is why Nuzlocke challenges have had this kind of rule creep in the past few years. In the beginning, it was just the 2 basic rules. 1 Pokemon per route, and if a Pokemon faints, it's dead. Then we got to hardcore Nuzlocks. No items, set mode, level caps. But these days, that isn't nearly enough for a run of any vanilla Pokemon game. Hell, it's barely enough for most ROM hacks. Now you need to have EVs turned off. You need to ban overpowered Pokemon like Gyarados, Blissey, and Legendaries. You have to do a monotype challenge. You have to ban healing at Pokemon centers so you can make the American healthcare joke. Get it? Do you get the joke? The joke's in American healthcare isn't free. Get it? All of this to arrive at a challenge that still isn't even that hard, because all of the fun and difficulty have been optimized out of it with calculators, level edging, and counter routing. It's just a disaster. I don't even want to think about where this shit will be in 5 years. So let's finally pivot over to Fire Emblem for a comparison. You want to know how you make Fire Emblem difficult? You pick a harder difficulty on the main menu. And you don't play Sacred Stones, but you know what? Pokemon still makes Sacred Stones look like a fucking Kaizo game. Fire Emblem games are built from the ground up with challenge in mind. There are some entries that trend towards the easier end of things, but a majority of Fire Emblem games have at least one difficulty that turns the game into an extremely tense test of your game knowledge, your strategic acumen, and occasionally a little bit of your luck. Now, I'm not sitting here and saying that Fire Emblem is this super mature, adults-only game. This is definitely not something my dad would play, but it does have the advantage of not being made for elementary schoolers. Maps are designed with an intimate familiarity of what the player has access to at that point in the game. With this information, the devs can give you interesting, difficult problems with multiple intuitive solutions, leaving room for the player to express themselves while still being challenged. Fire Emblem is like those puzzles with the different shaped blocks and holes, but they give you multiple different pieces that can all fit in the square hole if you maneuver them right. Think something like Conquest Chapter 10. There are multiple ways to use your limited resources in that chapter to survive the onslaught. But even then, you don't have to stick to these intuitive solutions. With enough planning and some elbow grease, you can smash a square peg right through that round hole. You can use your units to do things further from the developer's vision in a satisfying way. For example, sure, Meg may be a terrible unit in Radiant Dawn, but if you want to use Meg, you can dump tons of bonus XP into her and give her the Allandite at the end. Or you know what? Fuck it. If you want, you can just forget putting any shapes in any holes and just lob a bomb at the puzzle by grinding your units to an absurd degree on a regenerating boss, building an Ophelia that just kills everything on the map and wins by default, or skipping the entire map with a warp staff. All of this is happening while the game is throwing challenge after challenge at you. You're constantly at risk of losing a unit or getting a game over if you make the wrong move. While there is freedom in the hundreds of ways you can express yourself as a player, there is still danger lurking around every corner. Even in the most vanilla of vanilla Fire Emblem runs, just a typical playthrough, any given moment is an order of magnitude more tense than an analogous moment in Pokémon. With this high base level of difficulty, Fire Emblem doesn't really have to flex much to make an entertaining challenge run, while Pokémon has to be smothered with dozens of rules and modifications to even begin. All you have to do to make a challenge run out of Fire Emblem is use its most popular rule set, the Iron Man run. It's like a Nuzlocke, but good, and not antithetical to the series' core identity and themes. Fire Emblem already has permadeath built in. All you're doing in an Iron Man run is committing to not reloading your save if a unit dies. For the vast majority of the series' history, this wasn't even really a challenge run. This is just the way the game was intended to be played. Even in modern games with rewind features that are meant to take the edge off of permadeath for accessibility's sake, playing without them is still very much encouraged by the game's design if you want to do it. Otherwise, why would they even include permadeath? Now, a game doesn't have to be hard to be an enjoyable single-player experience. Hell, Pikmin 4 is one of my favorite games of all time, and that game is so brain-dead easy that 4-year-old Soda Crab probably could have finished it right there alongside Pokémon Sapphire. If you're an intrinsically motivated player, Pokémon could be a great fit for you, just for the joy of exploring a world and befriending cute monsters. That's why so many people consider Legends Arceus to be the best thing Pokémon has put out in years. But if you're wanting something tough, or if you're wanting to make or consume content surrounding a difficult gaming challenge, you simply won't find it in Pokémon, even when heavily modified beyond its intended experience, while Fire Emblem comes right out of the box ready for it. But as we all know, the mainline games aren't exactly the be-all end-all of Pokemon's difficulty. Let's be real, when it comes to pre-Switch era Pokemon games, most of us are no longer using official hardware, meaning we aren't exactly restricted to Game Freak's questionable balancing decisions. But the thing is, whether you're playing Emerald or Emerald Kaizo, Pokemon still suffers from another inherent flaw that cripples its challenge run potential. Pokemon is way too simple. There is just nothing going on during your average turn of single-player Pokemon. Let's just look at the numbers, shall we? Barring very niche scenarios like an in-game double battle or using a pivot move like U-turn, during an average turn of a Pokemon Hardcore Nuzlocke, the grand total of decisions you can possibly make is 2. That's right, 2 decisions. Your first decision, attack or switch. Choosing either of these options will lead to a different decision, but they're mutually exclusive, so that's still only 2 decisions each turn. Your second decision is then, which of my 4 moves do I choose, or which of my 5 other Pokemon do I switch to? With both of these decisions combined, you have a grand total of 9 possible choices. Now, under pressure, on the fly, that might seem like a pretty decent range of options. I could definitely see myself sweating when the pressure is on and I have to decide. Just one issue. The pressure is never on, and you never have to decide, because the standard for these Nuzlocke videos on YouTube is that they've already meticulously plotted out every turn, and are going in with as close to 100% chance of victory as you can possibly get. Even if the chance of victory is below 100%, it's not because there's room for error on their part. Again, they've already calculated the objectively correct moves to make with the resources they have. There's no question of, did I make the right choice? There's only the question of, do I get the right damage roll or avoid the critical hit? The drama, what little of it there is all coming directly from the game itself. None of it is from the player's input. Technically, it's possible to solve just about any turn-based game like this, but Pokemon's simplicity makes it so incredibly easy to completely solve any given fight with the right external tools. I reiterate, when the game is simple enough to make every move the right move every time without fail, you remove all drama from the player's input and rely on the game's RNG to provide all of the tension. This is even with me being charitable to Pokemon and assuming there's even an ounce of difficulty in the first place. In most cases, outside of extremely difficult ROM hacks, you can just leave the calcs at home and easily parse out the 100% objectively correct move with nothing but game knowledge. Do you really need the calculator to tell you the correct move is to keep your Charizard in using Flamethrower on the Grass-type Gym Leader instead of going with one of your other 8 objectively worse options? And if you pull back the curtain far enough and go even further, learning how Pokemon's AI works on top of your usual game knowledge, you can lock yourself out of fun with Nuzlocks forever, even if you never touch a calculator again. Jumping over to Fire Emblem once again for the comparison, it's like night and day. I can barely even begin to calculate the amount of options you have in a turn, since that would be more math than I've done since high school. But let's take a whack at it, shall we? Now let's be generous to Pokemon here and assume this is one of the simplest turns in Fire Emblem history. Let's pretend for a moment we're in a big open field, and it's super early in the game, so we only have 6 units and they all only have 5 movement, because early Cavaliers don't exist in this hypothetical turn of Fire Emblem. Fortuitously, there aren't even any enemies in range, and also our units are just a bunch of identical Roys with 0 aid and empty inventories, so we don't have to worry about rescuing and trading. How did we end up here? I don't know. It's a very weird turn of Fire Emblem. Even in this scenario, where a Fire Emblem turn is just about as simple as it possibly can be, there are still over... this is editing, Soda Crab. I think I might have gotten my math wrong, because I came up with, this hilariously large number, and I'm not 100% sure if that's accurate, so, we're just gonna go ahead and pretend that I did the math right. I don't know exactly how many we're looking at, but, it's a lot more than 9. It's a lot more than 9. This is in a turn with no enemies, no items, no weapons, no mounted units, no decisions outside of moving our 6 Roys. In any realistic turn of Fire Emblem, there would be dozens more decisions that would lead to hundreds more outcomes. Now obviously a vast majority of these moves would be terrible. Why would you have your entire army run to the corner and unequip their weapons? You wouldn't, for the same reason you wouldn't switch your mag cargo in to an incoming hydro pump. But just about every turn of Fire Emblem ever will have dozens of moves that are good enough to consider between all of your units, while a turn of Pokémon has 8 wrong moves and 1 objectively correct one that you can just calculate. Even if there is an objectively correct move to make in a turn of Fire Emblem, you have to figure that out for yourself, and it's going to take a lot more thinking to get there. More often than not, you'll be picking the 2nd, 3rd, 4th, even 5th best move, because you're not omnipotent. This complexity and emphasis on the player's input and decision-making leads to far more interesting strategies and more dramatic stories created through gameplay than Pokémon could ever dream of. Has Pokémon's inherent simplicity always been a roadblock for interesting challenge runs, though? Not necessarily. After all, the author of the original Nuzlocke comic managed to lose a vanilla, not even hardcore Nuzlocke of Pokémon Ruby, something completely unthinkable to your modern-day Nuzlocke content farm. So how exactly did we get here? Well, let's set the stage. If you have even a passing interest in Pokémon challenge runs, you probably remember a few years ago as everyone was fighting the good fight against Emerald Kaizo. I was there, I was pretty tapped into the Nuzlocke scene back then. It was an awesome saga to watch unfold. But here, on the other end of it, 3 years later, I can confidently say that Emerald Kaizo and its consequences have been a disaster for the human race. Now, I'm not blaming anyone for this. It was a community-wide movement to do the impossible, to not just complete the hardest Pokémon game ever made, but win a hardcore Nuzlocke of it. At the time, I remember it being really exciting. Single-player Pokémon was being pushed to limits no one had even dreamed of. But the thing about pushing limits is that it's kinda hard to unpush them. Here we are, in a post-Emerald Kaizo world, and Pokémon is solved. Yes, I mean Pokémon, not just Emerald Kaizo. Players beat Emerald Kaizo by pulling out all the stops, and unfortunately for the Pokémon Challenge Run community as a whole, by pulling out all the stops on the hardest Pokémon game, they solved every other Pokémon game in the process. Because
Your clones are very impressive, you must be very proud.
every Pokémon game is the exact same thing. You've heard it said by every armchair game critic on YouTube for the past decade, but they only say it because it's true. Game Freak has been making the same game for almost 30 years now. Sure, mechanics have changed a little bit, features have come and gone, and of course there are always new Pokémon, but at its core, once you can beat one Pokémon game, you can beat them all. This homogeneity is incredibly detrimental to the Pokémon Challenge Run community as a whole, because quite simply, with the tallest mountain climbed, with a victory flag proudly planted at Mount Emerald Kaizo's peak, there's nowhere left to go but down. And nothing down there can provide even a modicum of the challenge that Emerald Kaizo did. How is anyone supposed to care about whether or not you can beat Pokémon Heart Gold with poison types only? Yeah, no shit, of course you can. They beat motherfucking Emerald Kaizo. This is a waste of everyone's time. Pokémon is solved. The only thing you can do now is wait around until another harder ROM hack comes out. Apparently this Run and Bun game is the new Emerald Kaizo, but what about after that? Even when the ceiling inches up every few years with a new ROM hack, everything below it stays at the exact same spot. I'll say it again, Pokémon is solved. Not any individual game. They're all the same damn game. We beat the whole series. Humanity beat Pokémon. The forbidden knowledge is already out there. All you have to do is learn it, and congratulations, you too have beaten Pokémon. Thankfully for me, as a Fire Emblem fan, I don't think one man could ever solve Fire Emblem in the same way. While Game Freak has been making the exact same game for almost 30 years, Intelligent Systems hasn't been able to decide what Fire Emblem game they've wanted to make for almost 35 years now, and I think that's a good thing. The closest Fire Emblem ever got to Pokémon's sameness was its 3 consecutive entries on the Game Boy Advance, Fire Emblems 6 through 8. They're all made in the same engine with the same assets. These are 3 great games, but they're all just different flavors of the same Fire Emblem Gatorade. Other than these 3 games though, holy shit man. Every other Fire Emblem game is so incredibly distinct from the games before and after it. It's not just all the games that are disconnected from each other either. I'm talking remakes, sequels, midquels, games dubiously connected through draconic Alzheimer's portals or shitty mobile games. They're all extremely distinct in their own ways. Learning to play Pokémon is like riding a bike. Once you learn, you never forget. Learning to play Fire Emblem is like juggling 17 different flaming chainsaws, just waiting for Intelligent Systems to chuck another one at you, hoping desperately it's a Genealogy remake chainsaw. I'm not kidding when I say this, there is genuinely more mechanical whiplash between the different paths of Fire Emblem Fates than there is between Pokémon Platinum and Pokémon Scarlet. It's all Fire Emblem. If you like one Fire Emblem, you'll probably like all of them, but everything from the stats, the weapons, supports, movement, classes, skills, none of it is consistent between any game. Let's look at the last 2 games as an example. Fire Emblem 16, Three Houses, was a grounded, pretty serious game where you play as a teacher at an officer's academy, and you teach your students different subjects and disciplines to influence their classes and skills and prepare them for a horrific war that tears the continent apart. Fire Emblem 17, Engage, meanwhile, is a doki doki waifu anime-ass Saturday morning cartoon in which you play as a sentient tube of Colgate toothpaste that can summon iconic Fire Emblem characters from the past to merge with your units and turn them into all-powerful demigods that can teleport across the map and deliver tactical nukes or shoot guided missiles from a fucking croissant. Being a Fire Emblem fan is kinda like going to college. You play most of, if not the entire series as your Gen Ed classes, then you pick 1 or 2 games to major in. Someone who has a doctorate in Three Houses would probably have almost no idea what to do in a Radiant Dawn Iron Man. You can solve Fire Emblem games as an individual, with lots of time, effort, and research. But once you solve one, you still have 16 more that are too different to apply all of your expertise to. Being good at Fire Emblem will help you in every game, yes, but there simply is no Emerald Kaizo for Fire Emblem. Fire Emblem isn't one giant mountain like Pokémon is. It's an entire mountain range where each one is its own joy to climb and conquer over and over again. This is what Pokémon needs for Nuzlocke to really work. It needs this kind of differentiation to keep things fresh and challenging. As long as they keep releasing the same game, nothing will ever change, especially when combined with the first 2 points. Identical games are bad enough. Identical games that are all equally easy and simplistic are a whole other level. No amount of player-side input like new rules, new mods, or entire new challenges can fix this problem. To quote Civilization franchise co-creator Soren Johnson, "Given the opportunity, players will optimize the fun out of a game. One of the responsibilities of the designer is to protect the player from themselves." In this way, Pokemon's solved status is something that only the developers can fix. But the problem is, the devs will never save Pokemon. The boys down at Game Freak have no reason to protect you as a player from yourself. In fact, it would be the antithesis to everything Pokemon is all about. They don't design these games for you and me. They don't design these games for Peachal, Flygon HG, Sylph Spectre, or any of these other challenge runners either. They design these games so that 4-year-old Soda Crab can walk into the Elite Four with his level 87 Swampert and become the very best like no one ever was. They design these games so my sister can relax and play Legends Arceus for like an hour on a weeknight after a long day of work. And on the rare occasion Game Freak does decide to do some real balancing, it's not for you, me, challenge runners, or even 4-year-old Soda Crab. No, it's so Wolf Glick can go win another tournament to make an hour-long video about that will give me YouTuber editing envy. Game Freak has no interest in turning Pokemon into fertile ground for challenge runs. No matter how many extra rules you scatter around the fields, nothing of real merit will ever really grow. The Pokemon Company has intentionally salted this earth. This might be a hot take, and I might be wrong, but to be honest, I believe this whole Pokemon Challenge YouTube ecosystem is headed for a huge collapse sometime in the future. I know I'm not the only X-fan getting burnt out by this kind of content, and in combination with Pokemon as a series gaining increased scrutiny as it declines in quality, I think the Pokemon YouTube bubble will someday implode under its own weight. Obviously, aside from being another thing that's important to me and Nintendo's other flagship RPG, the Fire Emblem comparison isn't really perfect, but I think the contrast helps to illustrate that Pokemon is really left in the dust when it comes to an engaging single-player experience. It's not just Fire Emblem. Just about any RPG, or most other games for that matter, have so many more interesting challenges to explore, whether they be self-imposed or built into the game itself. Now, I'm definitely not saying you to stop enjoying Pokemon. I can totally see the appeal, even if I don't really enjoy the modern games anymore. But honestly, in my heart of hearts, I think Pokemon is better suited for its intended purpose of being a chill monster collector where you can bond with cute creatures and watch them grow in battle. And if you want to go beyond that, if you really want to get deeper into Pokemon, well, the competitive scene is right there. Pokemon Showdown is free. In essence, what I'm really trying to say is that if a challenging single-player experience is what you're looking for, it might behoove you to expand your radius a little bit and look elsewhere. I'd love it if you'd check out Fire Emblem, since it's my favorite game series and there's no truth in the universe more absolute than the Pokemon to Fire Emblem fan pipeline, but there's so much out there that I'd be happy to hear you found anything else that you might enjoy. But while you're looking for a new game, I humbly request that you look to the subscribe button as well, not just for me, but for the sake of our nation. As returning viewers may be aware, Crustacean Party presidential candidate Jet the Hawk has finally pulled ahead in the upcoming election, with a 10-point lead in the most recent polls. Unfortunately, our bitter enemy Crustaceus, also known as the shrimp who slithers in the dark, has recently endorsed controversial candidate Edelgard von Hresfelg, whom he intends to use as a puppet leader. Subscribe to the Soda Crab channel to widen the gap between Jet and Edelgard, and to ensure the White House doesn't become a proxy for Crustaceus's evil machinations. Thank you.